Dan. Dan is 17, has a pretty normal, stable home life. 2 working parents and 2 younger sisters. He plays football and guitar and has been dating the same girl for the past 2 years. He is chatty and upbeat, pleases all his teachers, and does pretty well at school. So in terms of high school social status, Dan is doing pretty well. However, in senior year, Dan runs into a bit of trouble, and not with alcohol or schoolwork, you know, the usual teenage problems. No, Dan starts to feel quite anxious. Sitting in class, he is constantly tapping his feet and feeling paranoid about implausible situations. And while at night he struggles to fall asleep, and when he wakes in the morning, he can't make it to the shower. He is tired and apathetic, and the thought of school and even football practice is daunting. Now, this is strange for active and vigorous Dan. These feelings continue. He is lost and questioning himself, but he forces himself to keep face and drags himself through each repetitive day. He is disturbed by his weird feelings, but saying something to his parents and even his friends is even scarier. Now, let us keep Dan in mind as the silent sufferer. Now, I could stand up here before you all and talk about the disturbing reality that statistics regarding mental illness in teens present. However, my aim is not to further instill this fear of the mental illness into you. Instead, I would like to talk you through a project I ran for a young scientist competition and share some of the findings and the aspects I consider to have great relevance in our awareness of, firstly, mental illness, but secondly, where our stigma comes from. Now, there is one thing I would like you to take from the next 15 minutes. It is that mental illness is not something to be hushed up and avoided, just because we can't physically see it or understand it. So we all go through this phase in life, whether it lasts for 5 seconds or for 6 months, where we question ourselves. I mean, it's deeper than that. It's more like we question who we are, why we're here, and what our purpose is. Usually, I guess, this phase passes and you're left in peace again, ready to move on past your brief confusion. Well, for me, it wasn't like that. I had been around what we call, or what I called at the time, irrational behavior, and had begun to see the human brain for what it was, in all its deficiencies. I was seeing the profound effects of our ignorance towards what I would later learn was no other than explicit mental illness. So as I mentioned, I was questioning it all, and by this I mean, why our ignorance? Baffled and inquisitive, I couldn't understand my own stigma. I mean, I knew there was a misunderstanding, and ultimately I wanted to dissolve it for me and for others. Thus, I became fascinated by this complex organ, the brain that essentially has power over who we are, or at least how we display ourselves, our actions, our thoughts, and even our moods. I was puzzled by this reality that we could feel feelings that were different from happiness and contentment. So I was driven by this weird mid-teenage crisis to investigate the colossal subject of mental health. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, I'd entered into this young scientist competition in Ireland. So I began to plan my project, and later a friend, Kira, joined me. So the initial basis for the experiment was based around this idea that mental illness is frequently overlooked due to our constraining stigma, and that perhaps our stigma was due to our lack of understanding and education around this somewhat misunderstood topic. The approach was simple: to investigate the consciousness of young students around different signs and symptoms of mental illnesses, the frequencies at which they occur, and therefore the form they appear in. Now, we considered the opinions of 388 students. We designed a survey within which the questions we believed would provide us with an understanding of students' awareness were included. Questions such as, what does the term mental illness refer to? And from this, students were given a blank space within which to provide us with their answer. These answers were then categorized, and the following was found. 36% of students concluded that the term mental illness meant that there was a problem with the brain. 30% of students concluded that the brain could not function properly, while 22% of students concluded that the term mental illness solely referred to depression. Secondly, students were asked for a single descriptive word, that of which they believed best described mental illness. And the following were potential options: unreliable, stressed, unpredictable, scary, funny, sad, normal, happy, reliable, crazy, and irritable. Words most commonly selected by Irish students were that of crazy, unpredictable, scary, and sad. So as you can see, there is a trend here. that of our limited understanding and therefore our labeling of mental illness as crazy and a problem with the brain. Now let us consider this. We asked students if they thought it was possible to recover from a mental illness. And from this, an amazing 82% of students concluded that it was. So this 82% of students were then asked how long they thought it would take. And from this, 55% of students, that is 212 of these students, concluded that it would take years. So students have realized it is possible to recover, except it will take a long time, and yet students throughout the whole world will wait until the presence of mental illness has developed and become a threat to their health, both physically and mentally. Take, for example, anorexia. Often we don't notice sufferers until the physical symptoms of severe weight loss are right in front of our eyes. But why the silence from, for example, the sufferer of anorexia, anxiety, or depression? Now, as I have only considered a sample of young Irish students, it may be a huge generalization to state that the level of awareness as demonstrated by these students may be applicable to people throughout the whole world. However, this connection, that of our stigma inhibiting our confrontation of our mental health issues, may actually be a common trait fundamental to us all. From looking at these findings, it is only logical that the link be made between the unawareness of youth to mental illness, and I mean its labeling and its misconception of being a real problem that can be treated, and therefore the care for their own mental health. And this is the point that I'm trying to get at. How can we, and I say we because I am a member of this unconscious youthful generation, learn to address potential abnormalities if we suppress them or attribute them to being problems fundamental to ourselves? This apparent labeling of mental illness as scary and a problem with the brain makes up the basis for our obnoxious stigma. Now, as we give energy to the stigma in the form of misunderstanding or even humble unawareness, we further suppress our understanding, and thus, consequently, we are presented with a potentially damaging situation. This stigma, as highlighted by students in this investigation, is based around the idea that there is a problem with the brain when mental illness is present. So if this is a stigma as perceived by these students, then what student would openly admit to feeling any nature of this mental illness? Peers and the greater society would therefore attribute the individual to being unpredictable and scary. So if reality is punishing to the presence of mental illness, then what choice do we have? Other than to let our thoughts of worthlessness and of our imperfections dominate us. We are youthful and susceptible, and society almost takes advantage of this, often fueling our inner dilemmas. Now, we are taught about the importance of physical health and the benefit it has on our concentration levels. From a young age, we have mandatory physical education classes. We learn how to take care of our physical health and the dangers of feeling physically unwell, and therefore the impact this will have on our lives. However, we are not taught about potential abnormalities in our mental health. And when I say this, I mean those thoughts that threaten our stability. Those thoughts that leave us wondering what the point of it all is. That perhaps develop because the feelings we have again been suppressed by the stigma that we hold. And if we are never taught of ways of which to deal with the intrusion of these thoughts, then they may begin to consume us. I know what the symptoms of flu look like, and I know how it feels to have a fever. However, what I didn't know until recently is what it feels like to be anxious, or to have that person in your brain telling you that you shouldn't get out of bed because it just simply isn't worth it. And we aren't taught about these feelings. Your parents don't sit you down. You don't attend mental health class. And the majority of us don't discuss these things with our peers. Therefore, we are out of our depth. These feelings are foreign to us. However, over time, as we neglect to address them, they become potential threats, thus affecting the way we behave. But what do we do about this? Call it a phase or attribute it to being a teenage problem and move on until somewhere down the line, the presence of mental illness hits us once again in the face. Why, instead of avoiding the nightmare of living through a mental illness, do we not instead go to the psychologist, as readily we do the local GP? Because presenting symptoms of depression, for example, for up to 2 to 3 weeks, is actually known as being clinically depressed. And when our temperature is high and we are feeling fluey, we take a vitamin C, get an early night, and the second we start coughing up blood, we rush to the doctor, receive a diagnosis of a chest infection, head to the pharmacy, pop some pills, and slowly we start to get better. But why is it so different with our mental well-being? Well, let's zoom in on that step we take before we head to the doctor. It's the self-medication stage of physical illness. I mean, we all have basic home remedies for physical problems. Plasters, lemon and honey, and ice packs. But what about cognitive skills for mental well-being? Learned optimism, mindfulness, and positive thinking aren't generally present anywhere in our nurture or education. So in this investigation in Ireland, we attempted to incorporate the topic of mental illness into daily life. So we had a support video for social, personal, and health education classes, which featured sufferers of mental illnesses. Now, this was an attempt to highlight the normality of the presence of mental illness and therefore encourage students to reach out. But what was up with Dan? Well, the thing is Dan is actually pretty normal. Perhaps Dan was going through a teenage phase, and not a smoking or a punk phase. Just a period in time in which Dan felt an alien in his head, and in high school. Perhaps Dan understands the common textbook talk of mental illness that we are presented with on the backs of magazines, yet Dan was harboring an emotional nigh. Not wanting to appear scary or unpredictable surpassed Dan's need for support. Now, Dan is just one anecdotal story. It is scary, and not mental illness as indicated by Irish students. What is scary is the effect of our creation of this powerful stigma and our fear of expressing our mental health issues. Perhaps we are unpredictable, even scary, and can appear crazy. But that is just because we are people. And as people, we are deeply irrational. And why stigmatize this? So the approach we took in Ireland was to alter the perception of mental illness and aim to have it be perceived alongside that of physical illness. And that is to be perceived as a part of everyday life and of common occurrence. Now, it is impossible and as far-fetched as once and for all curing cancer to suggest that we should stamp out mental health issues in adults and young teens. We need to stop the thought that these problems are fundamental to ourselves and instead realize that the problem is with the bold and intolerant stigma that we have created. The truth is that perhaps addressing mental health issues is in some ways harder than that of physical health issues, and yet our brazen stigma is in the way, and so the effects of our creation are catastrophic and life-changing. Now let us leave today with the aim that depression will one day be perceived as ordinary and as unremarkable as the common cold. And that if in a month from now, I or anyone in this room or watching online begins to feel scared and anxious at night and miserable and worthless in the day, we'll know of its ordinariness. And that this can one day become as commonly apparent as waking up with a tickly throat and treated with no less secrecy or shame. Thank you.